Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to start our program. Let me say, first of all, thank you for coming out. This is a listening session with our Attorney General, sponsored by the Atlantic City NAACP, and we appreciate all of you taking your time this evening to come out for this program. As you know, the criminal justice system and the subject of police community relations is a subject that the national NAACP has made a priority, and that we here on the local level have made a priority. And as we told the Attorney General's office, excuse me, we are very proud of the work of our local chief, Chief Henry White, in what he has done to improve, implement community relations, implement a higher standard of interaction between the police and the community, and mitigate a lot of the problems that you see across the country. And we wanted to bring the Attorney General down here, first of all, to show some of the initiatives that he is doing across the state and to give you, the community, a chance to interact. We're going to have remarks by Prosecutor Tyler before the Attorney General comes. Then the Attorney General is going to make remarks, and then we're going to have a chance for you to participate. We have our next generation NAACP young leaders who are going to pass out cards and pens, and if you have a question, please write your question down, and we will make sure that the Attorney General gets it. The reason we're doing this is because we want to make sure that as many people as possible have a chance to ask a question pertaining to the subject he's talking about, and also so that no one tends to dominate the conversation. I know we don't have anyone in that audience, in this audience, but oftentimes when you have a public session that happens and people who have genuine, legitimate concerns don't get a chance to participate. And the NAACP is an organization that is dedicated to civil and social justice and human rights for all. I'd like to recognize our mayor, too, who just came in, Mayor Frank Gilliam. And we thank him. Mayor Gilliam is an active member of the NAACP, and we appreciate his support and attendance at all times. Thank you, Mayor. Now for introductory remarks and welcome our prosecutors, Prosecutor Damon Tyner.
Thank you, Kaleem, and welcome to everyone here this evening to discuss this very, very important topic. I first met our Attorney General, Gurbir Grewal, when I was shortly after I was sworn in as the Atlantic County Prosecutor. We had these monthly prosecutor meetings, the County Prosecutors Association of New Jersey. So if you can imagine, 21 people who are the chief law enforcement officers of each county throughout the state of New Jersey, who all think they know what's best for their county, sit around the table. And we discuss various issues. But at that time, Atlantic sits next to Bergen, and our Attorney General was Bergen County Prosecutor. And we very quickly realized after being introduced to one another that we had a synergy that we believed that we should have some very, very good relationships within our community. I was very impressed with some of the things that he was doing up in Bergen County and emulated some of those things right here in Atlantic County shortly after I became a prosecutor. And last summer, you might remember, the General came down and walked with us on our community walks through our neighborhoods. Shortly thereafter, his staff and others would come down when we had an officer-involved shooting. Ironically, that officer-involved shooting occurred approximately 2 weeks after we had a community session on use of force at Atlantic City High School to explain the process about when an officer-involved shooting at that time, the process has since changed, but at that time, what would happen? I can tell you that at that time, there were 3 people in the audience. And I called on those 3 people after we had our unfortunate incident, and they were really good liaisons throughout the community to tell people, no, you know, the prosecutor tried to reach out to everyone to talk to them about what would happen in a situation like this. I was very fortunate. I'm very, very fortunate to be born and raised in Atlantic City and have the relationships that I did, lifelong relationships. So I think that I get at least a modicum of credibility when something bad goes wrong, that I can reach out to a Steve Young, that I can reach out to the mayor, that I can reach out to the chief, and we can come to a collective message and form a collective message that the community will accept as being our word. And I think that is so important. It's something that I know that the general shares, and that's why he's here this evening. So I want to welcome our Attorney General to Atlantic City. He is not a stranger. He's been here more than any other Attorney General that I can remember from years past. And that's not a knock on them, but I think it just demonstrates his commitment. And I don't think it's a knock on any other community, because he's up and down this entire state. And he's probably on his 5th cup of coffee today, so because I've been with him for the full day. But I really want to welcome the Attorney General to our community to discuss this topic. And thank you very much, General.
Thank you, Prosecutor Tyner. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yep, this is working. It is a pleasure to be down here. I want to thank Councilman Shabazz for the invitation. I want to thank the mayor for welcoming us to Atlantic City this morning at the Noble Conference. I've been here all day attending various events, and I do come down here quite a bit to the point that I have a loyalty card at Heyday Coffee, which I'm almost full on, so the next time I come down, I'll have a free cup of coffee. This is a special place, and it's a city that I am fully committed to helping move forward through all the resources we have at the Attorney General's office, working with Jim Johnson, working with DCA, working with your prosecutor, working with your chief of police to do whatever we can to help improve public safety here in Atlantic City, and working with PRETA and others, of course, as well. I've been holding these listening sessions around the state for a period of time now. And the most recent ones that we've been holding center around the use of force and the force report that was published by New Jersey Advanced Media or the Star Ledger last year. And I held a listening session like this one about a month ago in Newark. And that listening session was with Newark Central High School students. And we had about 30 students in the room. And we were talking about law enforcement, and we were talking about their interactions with law enforcement, and we had a distinguished panel. We had the mayor, we had the police chief, we had the police director, we had their superintendent. And after a while, you know, listening to this back and forth, I just said, you know what, let's stop for a second. I want to go around the room, and I want to hear from each of you in one word or 2 words. Describe for me your perception of law enforcement or your interactions with law enforcement here in Newark. How would you describe it? How would you capture it? And as I went around the room, I heard fear, distrust, scared, fear, scared, those types of words. I'm afraid. And that really, really highlighted for me something that we unfortunately know, that there are huge divides between law enforcement and community in this state. And they are divides filled with fear and mistrust. And there are divides sometimes created by individual past experiences that people might have had with law enforcement. Or there are divides that are created by something like the force report that comes out and highlights disparities in use of force among minorities. or they're divides created by officer-involved shootings in the community and about the lack of communication and the lack of information that's being provided by law enforcement to the community. Or perhaps because someone's not held accountable for their actions. And that's what I saw in that room with those students. And so one could leave that room and just be pessimistic that these divides are just going to widen, that there's nothing we can do about it. But I think we have an opportunity, because divides, I think, can be bridged. They can be narrowed. We could bring people together. We could fill those divides with trust and try to move forward. And that's what we've been doing at the Attorney General's office. I set 4 priorities when I started office in January. 1 was combating the opioid epidemic in this state. Number 2, I wanted to fight violent crime. Number 3, I wanted to step up our affirmative litigation. With issues coming out of Washington, I wanted to do more to stand up for New Jerseyans. But 4th, and not necessarily in that order, I wanted to spend my time in office improving police-community relations, strengthening trust between law enforcement and community, using the resources that we have at the Attorney General's office to prompt those discussions. Because I think you can build trust in settings like this. You can't build trust at a yellow police tape at a shooting. You can't build trust in the wake of a shooting or a crisis. But certainly coming together in rooms like this, you can clear up misunderstandings of how law enforcement operates. You can have honest discussions about individual concerns or experiences with law enforcement. And so to really drive home that point, that we can really bridge those divides and bring communities together, we started a program called 2121. A lot of our prosecutors were already doing this, but we said to our 21 county prosecutors, we mandate each of you to hold 4 community meetings, 1 each quarter, on an issue of mutual concern with you and your community. And guess what? We're going to make it easy for you. We'll tell you what those issues are. In quarter 1, we want you to talk about officer-involved shooting investigations, perhaps the most sensitive topic we could deal with when it comes to law enforcement and community. In quarter 2, talk about the opioid epidemic. In quarter 3, we want to talk about immigration. In quarter 4, we want to talk about bias crimes. That was the first year, and we did that. 84 community meetings across the state between law enforcement and community members in settings like this, not at the prosecutor's office. I said, don't invite people to the prosecutor's office, or don't invite them to the courthouse. Go to where the community is and have these conversations. And this year, we're going to do it again. We're going to have these discussions around other topics: juvenile justice reform, sexual assault issues when it comes to students on campus, so on and so forth. And I think that dialogue helps build trust when there is an unfortunate event, that you could reach out to Prosecutor Tyner, you could reach out to Chief White, and you could have an understanding that I have listened to these leaders, and I've sat with them, and I know how this process is going to unfold, and that we should sit back for a moment and let them do their jobs. You know, one of the areas that we talked about during these meetings was officer-involved shootings, as I mentioned. And I think it's important, and I'll touch on it briefly, on how we investigate those types of cases. Because oftentimes we hear from the community, well, why aren't you releasing the videotape if you haven't? Why aren't you releasing the dash cam footage? Why aren't you releasing the audio recordings that you might have? But when we had those 21 meetings across the state, we were able to say, you know what? The Attorney General issued a new policy, because before we sat on those videos till the investigations were complete, now we will release those videos, but we need a period of time to run out our investigation, so we can interview witnesses and get their recollections of what transpired rather than what they see on a television. And so we could corroborate their recollections with the videotape and say, you know what? Witness Joe Smith came in and said A, B, and C, and that comports to the video. And so that's why we don't release them right away, but that wasn't good enough. We didn't want to use our exceptions to the Open Public Records Act to hold those videos for the whole investigation. We said we don't want a situation like Laquan McDonald in this state. So after 20 days, we will release those videos once those interviews are complete, because good, bad, or indifferent, we want that information out there, because the more we sit on it, the more the distrust grows. So that was one concrete thing that we did with respect to officer-involved shootings. The other is, when we went and had these conversations, we talked about how we investigated these cases. Now, through legislation, some of that has changed. Now, when there's a fatal officer-involved shooting, all of those investigations are taken out of the county prosecutor's hands, and they're moved to our office. The Division of Criminal Justice, under the direction of Director Allende here, runs out those investigations. And the reason we do that is we want the community to know that we understand that you might have a concern that there may be a conflict of interest with the local prosecutor running these investigations out. So we're going to give it to the Attorney General's office so we have an independent prosecutor running out these investigations. That is the new paradigm, and that is a legislatively mandated paradigm. So you can have that trust and know that there is no one close to the investigation, no one close to the local department running out such a sensitive investigation. Now, for non-fatal officer-involved shootings or uses of force, we have a robust process to make sure that those are also done in a conflict-free manner. Our local prosecutors run those out, not the local police department. If there's such a situation in Atlantic City, Prosecutor Tyner's office will run that out after doing a thorough conflicts check. And if they have a conflict of any type, perceived or actual, that investigation moves to our office, and then we'll run it out. Or we could reassign it to a neighboring county. But if Prosecutor Tyner runs it out, there's still a second check. Before he makes the ultimate conclusion, that whole file goes to Director Allende's office, and they review it. And they could say, you know what, we agree with your conclusion, or we disagree with your conclusion, or we want you to present this to a grand jury. So checks and balances, systems are in place to ensure that these matters, these highly sensitive investigations, are run in a manner where they're free from bias, free from conflict, and that the public can have trust in the outcomes that this system produces. So that's the framework of officer-involved shooting investigations that I was asked to touch on today. But the other part of the discussion, and what I really want the listening session to focus on, is use of force. Last year, when the Star-Ledger released the force report, that was a wake-up call for law enforcement in this state. For about 17, 18 years, we mandated that our local police departments fill out use of force forms, and that they report those forms to their county prosecutors, and they then come to the Attorney General's office. And I suppose 17, 18 years ago, that was designed to use those forms as an accountability tool, to do some sort of analysis with them. But I hate to tell you, nothing was done with them for all those years. We didn't have a system in place to analyze them once they came to the AG's office. There were no robust checks and balances to identify patterns or to identify deviations, that somebody was using force at a higher rate, somebody was using force disproportionately against minorities. We fell short. We fell short. And what that report highlighted is that while we collected this information, we didn't collect it in a standardized form. For example, Atlantic City may report all uses of force, even minimal force required to arrest somebody. The state police, however, according to their rules, does not require a use of force report to be filed when minimal force is used to overcome minor resistance. And so that apples to apples comparison across the state is difficult to do when you're not on a level playing field. And the forms were all different, and the reporting mechanisms weren't easy. And so we decided, shortly after that report, that we were going to get this right in the state. We were going to be a model for the rest of the country. We were going to develop a system that standardized the reporting of use of force. We were going to make it easy. We were going to create an online portal. We were going to ensure that there was transparency in the system by sharing some of that data publicly at the end of this process. But importantly, we were going to use this new reporting system as a training tool where people fall short so they can get better. And where people really fall short, to use it as an accountability tool, to hold officers accountable when they use force in a way that they are not allowed to do. And so that work is underway. Tom Eichers, our director of our Office of Public Integrity and Accountability, since that report came out, we have been talking to academic institutions across the country. We have been talking to other police departments that have robust systems in place. We have been talking to vendors to create this system for us. We have been talking to working groups of law enforcement, and we've been talking to communities like this one to get an understanding of what should we be looking for. How can we use this tool to get better? And it is my hope that by the end of this year, we will have that tool online, and that we will make public portions of those reports so the public understands what our true numbers look like. How are we doing? Where are we falling short? But we're not stopping with that new system. We're also going backwards. We went to the Star-Ledger and we said, you guys did a great job. putting this tool together, putting this data together. Let us have that data. We ended up buying that data from them. We bought that data from 2012 to 2016, 5 years of use of force data. And now we are combing through that data for two purposes. Accountability. If people fell short during that period, they're not getting a pass because our system wasn't working. We're going to use that data to hold folks accountable if they deviated and used force improperly. And we're going to use it as a training tool. But even more than that, for 2017 and 2018, the 2 years between the data set the Star Ledger has and before this new report goes up, this new portal goes up, we are collecting use of force forms from all of our municipalities and analyzing them ourselves to make sure that we're staying on top of the issue and not falling short as we had done in the past. So it's my hope that this portal, this online reporting system, will achieve those goals of transparency, trust, and accountability. And it's not going to be limited just to use of force. We want that portal to be able to be used by our local departments to report other forms of data that are important to law enforcement, that are important for transparency, that are important for accountability purposes. And I think with something like that, with the commitment that we're trying to make, I hope that helps bridge that divide that I spoke about earlier a little bit more. I hope that it starts to fill that divide with a degree of trust. And I hope that when I go back to Newark Central High School next year, or maybe the year after, if I go around that room, I get some different answers. But it's going to be more than the reporting. It's going to be the community policing that Chief White and Deputy Chief Sarkos are doing here in Atlantic City. It's going to be more meetings in rooms like this one. It's going to be just more conversation and more dialogue. Because I think at the end of the day, Chief, every law enforcement executive that I met this morning at the Noble Conference in Atlantic City, all has the same goal in mind, that we don't want those outliers. We don't want those horrific incidents. We want to stop them before they happen. And the final thing that I'll leave you with before we open it up, any use of force is horrible. Any excessive use of force is a horrible situation. But I think we could take a little bit of comfort in knowing that between 2012 and 2016, the data set that the Star Ledger looked at, there were about 70,000 use of force forms reported or incidents reported. If you analyze that with respect to the number of arrests during the same period, it's about 30 uses of force over every 1,000 arrests. Where less than 3% of the arrests, or approximately 3% of the arrests in this state involved some use of force. The majority of those were minimal contact, minimal force to just subdue somebody or guide them into a car or putting hands on somebody. They weren't strikes, they weren't kicks, but there were disparities in race, and that is troubling. And so we are committed to fixing that, and we'll do everything possible through meetings like this one and through the systems we're putting in place to address those concerns. And with that, I'm happy to spend the bulk of our time in listening mode. So thank you so much.
General, thank you so much for those remarks. Thank you for coming down to Atlantic City. Thank you for your attention to Atlantic City. I don't have to tell this audience that police community relations, the use of force, the disparity in policing is something that's troubled this country and unfortunately troubled this state. But we appreciate your efforts since you have been the general. And let me just say that Chief White has done an admirable job. When I was elected to council, during the time between the general election and when we were sworn in, 3 new council people were in City Hall. And we got a seminar on alleged police excessive use of force, police misconduct in Atlantic City. And the number of cases was staggering. But I can report to you, and we all know, that under Chief White's tenure, those number of cases have went down dramatically, and that the relationship between the police and the community has increased and improved dramatically. I'm not trying to say everything is 100%, but we can say that we've seen a drastic improvement since Chief White has been the chief of police. That's one of the reasons that the NAACP reached out to the general and said we wanted to bring people together. We wanted to focus on the fact that Atlantic City has turned a corner. We have a new chief who has brought in a new culture which has new results. So we're here tonight. The next part of the meeting is going to be the listening session, as the general said. And to take us into that is Yolanda Melville and Sierra Logan, who are members of our next generation NAACP leadership. Let me just say before they start that, again, excuse me, the procedure that we have developed is designed to make sure that the general gets as many questions as possible so that people can get his response and so we can get your input. Yolanda Melville.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sierra Logan. As Colleen just mentioned, we are a part of the Next Gen program. I'm getting, does that mean you can't hear in the back? Yes, sir. Okay.
I can't hear you.
All right. Thank God for mics. All right, so my name is Sierra Logan. I'm a local attorney here at Fox Rothschild, Atlantic City office. I'm also a part of the Next Gen national program. A lot of people ask us, what is Next Gen? Before I hand it to Yolanda to tell us about how the listening session will run, we just want to explain a little bit of what we are and what our objective is. We do have some other folks that are also a part of the Next Gen program. Am I right? I think we have a couple others, Nastasia, photographer, and I think we do have a couple of others in the audience as well. It's a young leadership program from the ages of 21 to 35. It is designed by the NAACP Nationals. It's a competitive application process where it's a one-year-long program where we are taught leadership fundamentals, criminal justice, voter registration, and political action. So that is what we do. We have a number of folks that are here from Atlantic City who were accepted as a part of that application process. And I think we have one of the highest, the Atlantic City branch has one of the highest in the state. The nation, even better. All right, with that being said, I'm going to pass it to Yolanda Melville.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Yolanda Melville. I'm an attorney at Cooper Levenson here in Atlantic City. I am a member of the 2018 class of Next Gen. I'm a graduate, and since that time, we've quadrupled our numbers now, so we have 4 here in Atlantic City who are taking on the process of the 2019 program. We actually have one of our other members from the Trenton branch, Austin Edwards, here tonight as well. To my right is Corey Young. Also to my right is Kayla McDermott Cobbs, and to the back taking pictures is Nastasia Davis. So we are your hosts of the evening. So walking around, we'll have blue cards, and no question is a dumb question. Every question matters. So if you have something that you'd like to ask, please write it down, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to get that information to the Attorney General. So without further ado, I'll leave, but I want everybody and encourage anyone here in the office, in the audience who does have a question to please ask it. This is one of the times that we actually have an opportunity to have an esteemed panel here. The public safety and criminal justice is one of the game changers for the national NAACP, which is part of our strategic plan, to ensure that certain information is dispelled within our branches. So we want to ensure that we take this opportunity that we have here in Atlantic City. And I know we all have questions. This is a very active city, so let's show our love and ask as many questions as possible while we have our panel here. Thank you. I do. Oh, I'll start with the first question. Sorry about that. So the first question is from our Next Gen team. Attorney General, you talked about excessive force. Can you, in your words, tell us what is considered excessive force by a police officer?
I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to that question. It's a good question. But I think that the measure there is reasonableness and proportionality to the situation that the officer is dealing with. And so when it comes to use of force, there's certainly a continuum. As the danger to the officer increases, so too does the officer's ability to use deadly force increase in a situation, but it is a continuum, and it's a highly fact-specific question that is difficult to answer in the abstract, but it's reasonableness and proportionality in the situation. While we wait for additional questions, I'm going to just mention one other thing that's highly topical today, April 29th. Oftentimes, we talk about how we could address issues in law enforcement when it comes to issues of bias and when it comes to issues of sort of disproportionate numbers of minority youths incarcerated or arrested, or a lack of trust in law enforcement. I think one way, and certainly a great way to improve the system, is when law enforcement reflects the communities it serves. I think that is a key way to build trust. The most visible face of law enforcement in this state is the New Jersey State Police. They are the most visible face of law enforcement in this state. And the application process for the New Jersey State Police opens today for the next number of classes. So from April 29th to May 12th, the New Jersey State Police is taking applications for future troopers. So the pool that is developed from those during this period of time will feed the next 3 or 4, perhaps, state police classes. And that will be the state police for the next 20, 25 years. So I think we have a unique opportunity now to take that message back to your homes, back to your communities, to go online, to push someone who might be thinking about it, to fill out that application, and to be a part of that applicant pool. Because I can think of few ways as effective as increasing diversity in law enforcement to address the issue of trust that we're talking about this evening. And so I think that's a critical moment and opportunity that we have right now. Yep.
Okay, the next question is, how do you correct for microaggressions or implicit bias in the police force when it is presumed the aggressor is acting unintentionally but results in devastating and long-lasting impact on minorities?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way to deal with that is through training. And over the last number of years, we've redoubled our efforts to train on the very issues raised in that question. In 2017, the Attorney General's Office started the Community Law Enforcement Affirmative Relations Program, or CLEAR program. It's a training program that each year, from that year on, for the next 5 to 6 years, law enforcement across the state, all 30+ thousand law enforcement officers, have to be trained on certain issues. In year 1, I believe we trained them on de-escalation. So every law enforcement officer in the state got de-escalation training, which is critically important to diffuse a situation short of force. There are other techniques that officers can employ, verbal judo, other ways to bring down the temperature in a situation. And we made sure that our law enforcement officers got that training, and we are making sure that our new officers get that training in the academies. In 2018, we trained all of our law enforcement officers in this state on issues of implicit bias to make sure that they don't let that underlying bias. All of us have some form of implicit bias or another. It's scientifically proven. But the key is when you're in a position of authority and power, that you have to keep that implicit bias in check and make sure that you are making the right decision for the right reasons. And we teach officers techniques to recognize their implicit biases and to keep them in check. This year, in 2019, we're training all of our law enforcement officers on issues related to sexual assault investigations as part of the CLEAR Institute. So those are certain ways in which we could address those issues. And let me even go a step further. When I came into the Attorney General's office, issues of diversity and inclusion were highly important. So in June of 2018, I mandated that all of our divisions, all 13 divisions that make up the AG's office, all 8,000 employees, that all of those divisions had diversity and inclusion plans to address issues within those divisions, because a plan that works for the state police won't work for the Division of Law, and so on and so forth. But as part of that, I wanted all of our hiring managers to be trained on issues of implicit bias. So implicit bias didn't affect the hiring process. But even more than that, that 30,000, the training that the 30,000 officers received on implicit bias was great, but I wanted our state police to get even better training. So I mandated that all state troopers by the end of 2019 will be trained on implicit bias by a nationally recognized trainer. who will come in and train every one of our officers in a pretty robust, interactive training program on the issues of implicit bias. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to make sure that all 21 of our county prosecutors were trained on issues of implicit bias, and that their detectives were trained on issues of implicit bias by the end of 2019. So that will happen. And why is it important for prosecutors to be trained on implicit bias? Law enforcement officers might affect the arrest, but it's our assistant prosecutors and our deputy attorneys general who are going to argue for the sentence, who are going to negotiate the plea agreement. And that process needs to be devoid of any bias as well. And so that is a mandate that will be met by the end of this year as well. So I think with robust training, with all these programs, we address many of the issues that you raised in your question.
We do have one parameter. No one can ask about individual cases. Just for privacy and security, you cannot ask any questions related to an individual case. So just a reminder. What kind of co-op events between the police force and community members have you seen to be most beneficial in repairing relationships between the two?
I think the session that I had with the Newark High School students was probably the most impactful, no offense to anybody in this room, probably one of the most impactful meetings that I had. And I think what grew out of that is really a number of other steps that we were going to take together with the students, because I asked them, I said, how do we address this trust issue that you have? And they said, well, can we meet law enforcement officers in our schools in a safe setting like this? Can we get to know our local officers? So I think that type of program works when you're meeting in a safe setting in a school, that you get to know your neighborhood officer. When you have cops walking the beat, that they know their community. That builds trust. So when there's something happening in the community, a student's not afraid to report something to law enforcement. And another thing they also said is they didn't know what they're supposed to do or not do when they interact with law enforcement. And I said, well, how do we fix that? They said, well, what if we helped you make some videos and trainings for our peers? And so we're going to work with the students from Newark Central High School to have this type of messaging that's age appropriate, that they could put out on their own social media, and that they could message that better to kids than we can message to kids, because sometimes we don't speak the same language. And kids don't understand where we're coming from, but kids understand where other kids are coming from. So if we could start changing those misperceptions one at a time at a younger level, it helps improve relations. But more importantly, I think there is a tremendous distrust of law enforcement to the point that young kids don't want to be cops. And so when you start building that trust, you'll have more kids who are interested in pursuing that type of career. And I think those steps and that momentum, if you could build that momentum of diversity in law enforcement by the state police process that we're undertaking now, I think that goes a long way to addressing a lot of the issues that we're contending with right now.
In this city, we have 25% of South Asian, Bangladesh, Indian, Pakistan, and Vietnamese, we all own properties and businesses. Why don't we have a supervisor, representative at the police department?
So the question was focused on the South Asian community and Asian communities, why they're underrepresented in law enforcement? It's in supervisory positions. I think the answer there is, and I don't know the makeup here in this department, but I could tell you from my experience, growing up in an Asian American family, first generation immigrants, if I went to my mom and dad and said, Mom, Dad, I want to be a cop, they would probably not receive that too well. They would say, well, we left everything we had to come to this country so you could get an education, so you could make a lot of money, so you could be a doctor, and you could be this, and you could be that. And that is not unique to my experience. I think in the immigrant experience, and I think in the Asian American experience, there is not a push to have young people go into public service. I think that's starting to change. I think it's starting to change. We have a lot of young folks in politics and public service who are now making it more of an attractive option. And I think with time, as you start to fill the ranks at the entry level, Those officers then become the next supervisor. So I think it's part of a process. You need to encourage more folks to get into public service, to get into law enforcement for minority communities, and then eventually they work their way up, and that's how that happens.
Police trained to use deadly force first. Is there training to use taser? Should there be more training for non-lethal force, taser plus spray?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, it's a continuum. And so deadly force is not the first, it's not the first type of force that law enforcement officer should use. They're entitled to use deadly force if they reasonably believe that their life is in danger or if someone else might be threatened. And so that's when they could use that type of force. There's a continuum, and there's other forms of force. There's constructive, the tasers, they fall at an earlier level. We changed the rules on the ability to use tasers in more situations, so officers had more of a choice. So there's a continuum, and deadly force is obviously the last resort, but there are other types of force, including pepper spray and tasers that they could also use in proportion to the resistance that they're contending with.
There are places in Atlantic County that I will not drive through because of racial profiling. What is being done about that?
This state has a long history with racial profiling. We had a consent decree with the state police a number of years ago based on racial profiling on our highways. And we took a lot of steps, at least at the state police and across the state, to contend with racial profiling. There's a criminal statute that criminalizes racially influenced policing. We have zero tolerance for it. And the way at the state police we deal with it is that we look at the traffic stop data very closely. We look at all arrest data very closely to identify patterns and outliers, to see if there's any racial disparities in traffic stops, in arrests. And we use that as a training measure. If we see something pop up with respect to a particular trooper, we use that data to do further inquiry to make sure that that person is not engaged in racially influenced policing. But given that history that we had in the late 90s, early 2000s, we have come a long way in our training and in our accountability through the collection and use of data. And that's how we ensure that we don't have those blips and outliers.
In general, if I may, here in Atlantic County, at least since I've been a prosecutor dating back to March 2017, we've emulated those same practices. I get random reports on a regular basis where I review that same type of data to ensure that different communities are not racially profiling drivers. I have obviously a very, very sensitive reaction to racial profiling for natural reasons, but I have two young drivers as well that are females that drive through some of those same communities. I have a son that's 14 years old that's going to be driving. So I have a vested interest in ensuring that no one is subjected to that type of behavior, and if so, it will be criminally prosecuted under the statute.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, we have zero tolerance for any sort of racially influenced policing. We've worked too hard to shed that baggage of the early 90s and late 90s to come to where we are to tolerate any of this. When I was the county prosecutor in Bergen, I started in January of 2016, and a few months later, an email materialized. And it was an email that was sent to us anonymously and then through some advocacy organizations. And the email was from the then police chief of Wyckoff, New Jersey, encouraging his officers to engage in racially influenced policing. His email said, if you see suspicious black people in Wyckoff, stop them. And as you can imagine, that set off quite a response in my office. I immediately went there, talked to the local authority there. The chief was suspended. And we went back and looked into 5 years of arrest data, 5 years of traffic stop data, 5 years of juvenile contacts to make sure there were no disparities. And I'm happy to report there weren't any. And I'm also happy to report when we dug into the emails of that department, not one person forwarded that email, not one person responded to that email, not one person said, hey, that's great. That's a great idea, Chief. In fact, that email was an integrity test for that department, and they passed it with flying colors because they just continue to do their jobs professionally, and that chief is no longer a chief of police. One more thing. The same thing. We're dealing with an issue in Elizabeth, New Jersey. It's in the papers. I have zero tolerance for any type of racism or sexism, period, let alone in policing. It's not appropriate in 2019. It's never appropriate. And so we took strong steps, or strong actions last week. We took over the Union County Prosecutor's Office, and we took over the IA function at the Elizabeth Police Department. Again, to make sure that no one was acting in an inappropriate manner or condoned the type of statements that were being made by a law enforcement executive in that county. So that sends a strong message, zero tolerance.
General or Mr. Prosecutor, I heard the question about the driving through areas in Atlantic County. If someone experiences or believes that they experience a incident of racial profiling, how should they handle it?
That's a great question. You have a number of options. You could report it to your local police department's internal affairs function. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can report it to the Atlantic County Prosecutor's internal affairs function. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, you could report it to the Division of Criminal Justice, the Attorney General's office, to our internal affairs function, and we are all required to follow up on those types of complaints to ensure that nothing improper is happening in any one of our communities.
Attorney General, how are who decides who's eligible for receiving victims' compensation funds?
So the question was about victim compensation funds. We have an office called the Victim Crimes Compensation Office. They are a payer of last resort. So if individuals don't have the ability through insurance money as victims of a crime to get the type of money they need to address their health issues, they can go to the VCCO. If they need money for funeral costs, if they need money for relocation, if they need money for other expenses because they're the victim of a crime, they can go to the VCCO. Now, over the last number of years, the VCCO's payouts had been going down. And that's because of regulations and because of statute, that because of regulations, their payout amounts were capped. So last year, we worked on trying to change those regulations and increasing the number of payouts or the amount of payouts that the VCCO can give. This fiscal year, we're going to give out $1.7 million more than we did the prior year. We're going to hit nearly $10 million in VCCO payouts. So I think that's a positive step forward. There are still some issues. There's something called the contribution rule. If someone themselves was engaged in some type of criminal activity and they were victimized as a result of a crime or in a criminal act and they had drugs on them or they had a gun on them, in the past we handled that in a way where we denied that individual compensation or that individual's family compensation. So we are relooking at that contribution rule, it's called, to make sure that we're doing justice. A victim is a victim, and their families are suffering the same as other families of victims. So we are working on those rules. I brought in a woman named Elizabeth Rubman. She's a victim advocate. She started with us 2 months ago. We're doing a deep dive across the department because it's not just the VCCO that touches on victims' issues. The Division of Criminal Justice, through our state Office of Victim Witness Advocacy, touches on victims' issues. Our Division on Civil Rights touches on victims' issues. Our victim witness coordinators across the state deal with victims' issues, including at all of our 21 county prosecutors' offices. We know we can do better and that we fall short in some places, and so Elizabeth is charged with coming out with ways in which we can improve the system. She comes to this as a victim advocate, working in that space in Newark with the Newark Street Team, and so we're hopeful that she'll produce a report that will help us really become a national model on how we address victim issues.
Locally, Atlantic County has always been at the forefront of victims' issues. I'm proud that we were able to hire Ray Royster. Ray, if you would stand up. Ray should not be a stranger. He is been very active in our community. Ray is the victim witness coordinator for the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office. He oversees a staff of about 5 victim witness advocates, as well as other professionals. He is presented at the NAACP as well as other organizations throughout our county since coming on over the past year. So we are very happy to have him, and as well as the other members of his staff that are doing a phenomenal job with relating to our victims. Thank you.
Dear Attorney General, how many taxpayers of Atlantic City have to pay the suit filed against police officers accused of aggressive behavior, having previous fines on their records?
Say it one more time.
How is it that we, the taxpayers of Atlantic City, should have to pay the suit filed against police officers accused of aggressive behavior, those same officers having previous fines on their records?
Yeah, are you talking about, I don't know whose question was, but legal fees of officers who are accused of improper behavior, why are they continue to be excuse me? Oh, the judgments, the cost of the cities. Oh, yeah. So the judgments that result from improper actions by law enforcement officers. Yeah. I could just speak to my experiences at the state level. I don't know the situation in Atlantic City or Atlantic County as well. Unfortunately, we at the state level have had problem officers, problem troopers, whose conduct was flagged for us early on, who engaged in more serious conduct that resulted in litigation, that resulted in large payouts that we, the state, paid, and in effect, you, the taxpayers, funded. That is unfortunate. That is something that highlights perhaps a failure in supervision, whatever the theories are in a particular case, to hold the employer responsible, the state responsible for the conduct. I could tell you that we are trying our best to root out problematic officers earlier. We implemented a statewide early warning system directive. It never existed before. Last February or last March, I required every one of our police departments across the state to have early warning systems. And these are systems where there's a category of conduct, 13 or 14 categories, and we continue to refine these early warning systems. But if an officer trips 3 of those red flags in a 12-month period, it starts a remedial review process. So it's our hope that through those early interventions that we could identify those officers earlier, and if they need help, get them help. If they don't have a place in policing, get them out of policing. And with those types of checks and balances, that we could avoid those payouts, which are an unfortunate reality, not just in Atlantic City, but also in the state and other parts of this state as well, and other cities as well. And I think early warning systems, we also required random drug testing. Believe it or not, was never required across the state before. And it was a no-brainer. That's a ground ball. We're going to ask every one of our departments to engage in random drug testing programs. And now all 530-plus departments do that. All with the hope of identifying the next problem actor, because none of us want that outcome.
Next question. If recreational marijuana becomes legal in New Jersey, how will it affect a person wanting to become a police officer who uses the drug?
So if recreational marijuana becomes legal in New Jersey, how would it affect a police officer who uses the drug? This is an issue we haven't come up with a strategy to deal with right now. If legalization happens, we will issue guidance to law enforcement, and that guidance is going to say that while it may be legal for civilians to use, that it would remain illegal for law enforcement officers to use and not appropriate. We work on federal task forces with the DEA and other agencies, and it would still be a federal crime in certain cases to possess drugs and certain quantities of drugs. So. There's one thing I just wanted to mention, I failed to mention earlier. There was a question about outreach programs. We're investing through our State Athletic Control Board, working with Larry Hazard, our boxing commissioner, to start up again the youth boxing program here in Atlantic City. So we've funded it with about $65,000, and Larry should be getting that up and going in the short term. I don't know the exact time frame, but the notice is on our website, or there's information on our website.
It just went up, actually, thank you. It just went up on our website late last week. So if you go onto the New Jersey Office of the Attorney General, there is a button for OAG grant, and it's the first one listed. So if you want to see the specifications on that, please do look at it. It's a short window period. I believe the applications have to be in by the end of May. This is for Atlantic City.
Attorney General, you publicly testified in front of the Assembly against the independent prosecutor's bill. Given the community's fear and mistrust of law enforcement, and specific examples of corruption like Patterson, are you still against legislation and its mandate?
So I wasn't against the legislation per se. I thought the system we had in place before the law was a robust system that had the checks and balances and that addressed issues of conflicts of interest or bias. And that's still the system we use for non-fatal shootings, so that hasn't changed. I thought the two steps, the one that the local prosecutor does the initial investigation because they know their communities better, they're able to respond more quickly, that they're able to get videotapes and preserve evidence more quickly than a state response to a local jurisdiction, helped create better investigations. We are implementing the new legislation. The new law is the law, and we are following it. It's requiring us to ramp up and to get additional resources so we can deploy as quickly to our local jurisdictions when there is a fatal shooting. So it's going to require us to be a little bit flexible now in the sense that we don't have all the tools that we need right now, so we're using them from our local counties where we can, whether that's forensic tools or a crime scene help, until we get our system built out, because there was no lead time in the legislation. The bill was signed and went into effect, I believe, on a Wednesday, and there was a fatal shooting in Passaic County that Thursday night going into Friday morning. So as you can imagine, we didn't have a system built out, but we adapted, and we are running out that investigation pursuant to the new law, and we'll abide by the new law and run out our investigations as we did before in a conflict-free, bias-free way, and to hold bad actors accountable if that's the case, and if it's a justified shooting, to come to that conclusion as well.
You speak of training, applaud you for those efforts. What, if anything, you do to ensure we are not hiring racist individuals in the first place? For example, testing background checks, including checking their social media, etc.
Yeah, the question, it's a tough question to ask. I mean, we go through our psych tests, we go through background checks, we look at social media, we look to collect as much information about candidates as possible to root out those individuals that should not be in policing, whether it's because they have certain racist views that are going to corrupt their ability to act in an impartial manner or affect their job duties negatively. We try to do everything we can. I admit that there are likely people who still get through the systems we have in place, but it's through background checks and through the psych evaluations where we hope to root out bad actors.
How important is the psych evaluation of the officers?
Yeah, I mean, it's critically important. If someone fails their psych evaluation, they're pretty much disqualified, depending on the issue, from entering policing.
Can you bring back the 9:30 p.m. curfew? 3 sites or violation and your mom or guardian have to go to court.
As a father of 3 young children, I would love to do that. No, it's not on my list of things to accomplish during my 4 years. There's a question here. I think you might have dropped it. Why do police officers seemingly shoot to kill rather than try to wound or immobilize suspects? It's a reasonable question. But the training that law enforcement receives when they use deadly force is to shoot at center mass, which is the biggest target on the body. It's only in the movies that somebody's able to shoot the gun out of the hand. In real life, they're good, but they don't have that type of ability. And what if they miss? You know, so you're trained to shoot at center mass, and that's why you're not, and you're shooting to stop the threat and immobilize the threat. That's why you're not shooting somebody in their leg or their arm or trying to shoot the gun out of their hand or the knife out of their hand.
Should there be some kind of state oversight of the Atlantic City Police Department?
So we do have oversight over all of our police departments in the state. The county prosecutor is the first line of oversight that we have. He's a chief law enforcement officer in Atlantic County. It's his responsibility to oversee Chief White's department and all departments here in this county. If there are issues, he's supposed to be the first line of investigation. Certainly, we are there as well to have oversight if there are any sort of maybe an uptick in certain types of maybe uses of force, or if there's accusations of racially influenced policing, or if there's accusations of some sort of corruption. It goes to the county prosecutor first, or it could come directly to us. And we're not afraid to use our powers to hold folks accountable. That's what we did last week in Union County, and that's what we'll do during our time here if we see any sort of improprieties at the local level. And so first line of defense, second line of defense, and we're able to also go in on our own to hold departments accountable, whether it's overtaking a department, superseding their authority, superseding a function of the department. It's a power I used twice as a county prosecutor, and that the email promoting racially influenced policing, I took over the police department. I installed a monitor there. In the Palisades Interstate Parkway Police, they had all sorts of allegations against them of improper police pursuits, improper tactics, other accusations, and we took over that department using our authority as a county prosecutor and installed a monitor there. So we have those powers if the circumstances justify it to use them.
Before I go on to the next question, it's been a few minutes since you peppered the audience. If you have any questions on the note card, please raise your hand and we'll be around to collect them from you. Attorney General, you spoke about the opioid epidemic. How can our people trust the judicial system when doctors get probation for building multi-million-dollar empires, while our young Black and Hispanic children go to prison for possession?
So all I could speak to is my efforts at this moment. During the last 12 months, I've taken 18 licenses away from doctors for engaging in pill mills. Where appropriate, we've also pursued criminal charges, not just against doctors, but against pharmaceutical sales reps who pushed these highly deadly, highly lethal opioid drugs indiscriminately or engaged in kickback schemes with doctors. We're holding them accountable. So I have no problem holding bad actors accountable, whether they operate in the exam room, in the boardroom, or on the street corner when it comes to peddling dangerous drugs. And we've done it by suing New Jersey, one of New Jersey's largest companies, Johnson & Johnson. For the first time, we're holding them accountable. They own Janssen Pharmaceuticals, or did, when Janssen marketed a particular brand of opioid and engaged in fraudulent advertising with respect to that drug. And so we sued them to hold them civilly accountable. And that had never happened before. So we're not afraid to hold folks accountable, whether they're doctors, whether they're peddling drugs on the street, or whether they're sales reps. And that's something we'll continue to do in our efforts to fight this epidemic.
Other than waiting for the next media release of data information on policing reports, how can the general public gain access to these reports in state, in the county, in each local municipality?
I am 100% for transparency, and I think transparency is a cornerstone of building that trust I talked about earlier. This system that we're building out, there will be a part of it that will be publicly facing, that will be available to the public to see in a manner similar to what the media did. So it is my hope when that this system is created that you won't have to wait for the next news release, that we will have this information on our website, that you can look at it at a granular level, whether by county, whether by municipality, and that we will have that information in a way that you can compare it, apples to apples, oranges to oranges, and to see what is truly taking place across our state.
What have you done per policy to correct the fourth issue? If the policy is not followed, what will be done?
So I mentioned in my opening remarks, we've obviously made a commitment to build out a new system. We also, as I mentioned earlier, purchased the existing data from New Jersey Advanced Media. We're analyzing that data to hold individuals accountable if they engaged in the improper or excessive use of force or engaged in disparate treatment of individuals, if they engaged in any type of criminal conduct, and we could glean that from the data or initiate investigations from that data, we are doing that. And we don't wait till this new system's in place. We're going to use that old data to hold folks accountable across the state, and that's a charge that Tom has in his Office of Public Integrity and Accountability. That is something we thought was a problem in this state. Again, talking about trust. You know, I go to a lot of these meetings, and it is evident to me that folks have lost faith not just in law enforcement, but in government in general. And I don't have to tell folks here, New Jersey's got a long and sordid history with corruption in government. And so Tom's office, brand new office we stood up, Office of Public Integrity and Accountability, independent office within the AG's office that reports directly to me to carry out these investigations, the most sensitive investigations in our state, and to hold individuals accountable regardless of who they are, to include law enforcement, to include public officials, to include anyone in the public space who commits any sort of violation of the public trust. And I think it's going to take that type of effort to rebuild the public's confidence in our systems.
All right, here we go. What can be done to help the faith-based organizations, especially churches, to increase their security based on the attacks that can happen across the world?
That's obviously a timely question. With the state police colonel, Pat Callahan, the director of our Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, we participate in something called the Interfaith Advisory Council. And we hold conference calls when issues come up. And unfortunately, we've held too many conference calls in the last number of weeks in the wake of a shooting at a house of worship, whether it's a mosque or whether it's a church in Sri Lanka or whether it's a synagogue in Poway, California. And so on these conference calls, we try to reassure our faith communities that we're doing everything possible to keep them safe. So some of the steps we've undertaken is that through OHSP, there's grant funding available to houses of worship to target harden. It's unfortunate that we have to do this, but we have access to federal and state grants to increase the security at your house of worship, whether it's putting blast film on your windows or adding cameras outside of your church, or even state grants for hiring individuals for security guards, as security guards. There's funding available for that. And so this is something that we make available. It's on our website. It's on the OHSP website in particular, the Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness. These tools are out there. But we also do a lot of security assessments, and that's done a lot at the county level. So when I was at Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, I had one or two people dedicated to going around to houses of worship to do these security assessments and tell the pastor that he would be well to, take this shrub out because it's hiding this door, or he should add a camera here, or there's a weakness in your security here. And those security assessments are the first step sometimes in obtaining grants. And so we are willing to do those assessments for you from the state, and I imagine the prosecutor has something to add here as well.
Certainly. In addition to that, this is a timely opportunity to plug. On May 13th at Faith Baptist Church, we will be having an event that focuses on security for houses of worship. We had this event back in 2017. It was very well attended by churches throughout the entire community. There are some people that say that the only place segregation exists is on Sunday in our houses of worship. But I am proud to say that when we put a call out to the church community, every religion has come forward because they recognize the importance of these issues. They've all come together under one house, whether it's been Roman Catholic, whether it's been Baptist, AME, whatever it's been. Everyone has been very diligent in coming out to these events. So the next event will be on May 13th at 6 p.m. at Faith Baptist Church in Pleasantville. So we invite everyone to come out. In addition to that, I've been working with Councilman Shabazz to do a special event at one of the masjids as a result of the pending season of Ramadan. So that, we want to have a special event for that community so that we can focus on these events because, look, when something tragic like this happens, it affects all of us. And, it's something that we all take very seriously. But to echo the things that the General has said, we certainly will offer those same security assessments as well. Wanted to double back on an earlier question with respect to doctors seemingly getting off on, dispensing these opioids in being pill mills here in Atlantic County. I can think of immediately during my short tenure of 2 years, 2 doctors that come to mind. Dr. Alan Faustino is currently serving state prison time for running and operating a pill mill. We investigated that case. We sent him to prison. Jim Kaufman, people might think of him and say, oh, that was a murder case. He murdered his wife, and that's why you went after him. Actually, under my administration, the investigation started because he was also operating a pill mill. And we were able to build that investigation off of that and learn of the other criminal activity that he was involved in. So we take the operation of pill mills very seriously, and we are actively investigating all of those cases.
One thing on the houses of worship that I forgot to add was that our Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness also does, unfortunately, has had to do active shooter trainings for houses of worship, to come into your house of worship, to talk to you about how to respond if there was an active shooter, what the proper way to exit, the proper way to keep yourself safe. So we offer that training as well. And circling back to the doctor piece, as Attorney General, one of my responsibilities is to oversee the state's prescription monitoring program. And we have one of the most robust PMPs in the country. And we actively monitor the drugs being dispensed by doctors across the state. We break it down into morphine milligram equivalents, and we have national standards, and we look to see when there are deviations, and we use that tool as an accountability tool for doctors. It could be that somebody is just not trained properly, but it also could be that somebody is running a pill mill. So that flags for us outliers, and we use that to target those outliers as well to make sure that they are not feeding people's addictions, that they are acting in a responsible manner.
Police salary is one of the largest parts of our tax budget, but do not live in our community. Any efforts to increase residency fees?
That one, the question was about residency requirements in police, and a lot of towns have different requirements, so I can't speak to the issue here. I don't know if the prosecutor wants to speak to it.
No, it's always been my understanding that it's been a state law that you live in the community that you want to police in for at the time you're taking the test and for a year thereafter. Looks like it conked out. Certainly the law here in Atlantic City is that you have to be a resident of Atlantic City at the time you take your test, and then after you're hired and throughout that entire process, and then after you're hired for a year thereafter. It's always been my understanding that that is pursuant to state law.
I think it varies from municipality to municipality, so I think it's sort of one of these home rule things. If you were asleep, now you're not. That's a municipal law. No?
Which are Atlantic, Bergen, Camden, Essex, Hudson, Mercer, Middlesex, Monmouth, Passaic, and Union, account for 79% of the total number of Department of Corrections inmates. Essex is the highest at 15%. What do you account for that 2%?
So 10 counties account for what percentage of the DOC population?
9%.
79%? I don't know the answer to that. I suspect, I mean, those 10 counties probably have metropolitan areas with the higher density of criminal activity perhaps than some of our more rural counties. Perhaps that has something to do with it, but I haven't studied that issue and I didn't know that fact till now.
Thank you. When it comes to police promotions, why does it seem that only white officers and their family members are promoted? We would like to see more diversity in officers who are promoted.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak again for individual departments. I could just tell you my experiences. The state police has a very sort of database process, and there are a lot of different metrics that go into it about the promotional process and sort of the points that are afforded for different things. So it's a little bit more structured than the process I had when I was a county prosecutor in the department that I ran there. So, you know, I think diversity is important in policing. It's important in the leadership of policing. I've worked during my career to improve it. You know, when I left the county prosecutor's office, or when I started, I think my senior leadership was probably about 10% diverse. When I left, it was probably over 50% diverse. And so that was because as a county prosecutor, I didn't have to test, and I didn't have other, you know, restrictions on me. In some places you have testing and you have chief's tests and you have all sorts of other steps you have to go through. And so I think that just varies department to department. The state police has a very rigid system. I had a more flexible system as a county prosecutor, and municipalities do it differently. But I think there's a value, obviously, to making sure that we have a diverse leadership in law enforcement.
General, if I could, just for locally. Go ahead, Mr. Prosecutor. I apologize.
Go for it. And I was probably going to steal some of your thunder. With respect to the city of Atlantic City, I think it all begins and ends with where you come in. And recently, you just had the most diverse group of officers elevated from the Class 2 police officer position to be full-time police officers. It was an incredibly diverse group, and since they've been implementing the hiring process based upon the Class 2s, the ranks have certainly been increased. Recently, you saw a very diverse group of lieutenants, of sergeants that were promoted to lieutenant. So, you know, I won't bemoan the way we got here, but the reality is that under Chief White and Deputy Chief Sarkos and others, the numbers are changing, the diversity is changing. I can tell you that in the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office, our numbers upon taking over back in 2017 were very, very low. And as a result of recent hirings, we've been able to diversify our ranks with women, minorities, and others that are doing a phenomenal job. Now, I have a little bit more of a benefit in the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office because I don't have civil service requirements. And that is certainly a requirement within the Atlantic City Police Department, although it's suspended right now under the Municipal Recovery Act. But other local municipalities like Pleasantville and others, they have civil service requirements. I can't stress enough that, and I take a lot of things for granted sometimes since I grew up in a law enforcement family, but I can't stress enough. I think back to a story that the late Senator and Mayor Jim Whalen told me once. And he was very active, as many of you know, with a lot of kids in the area. And he would always encourage them to take the police or the fireman's test. And he always told me, he said, you know what, I don't understand it. Invariably, they always pick the couch over the car. And that's a joke with firemen and police. Policemen, you pick the couch over the car. But he went on to say that he was trying to understand why they would be very rarely to select being a fireman over a police officer. Both very dangerous jobs, both involve public service. And so he dug a little bit deeper. And the reality was that a lot of folks just didn't seem to have the mentors necessary within the police community. And it goes back to what the general was saying when he spoke to the students at Central High School in Newark, that they were only encountering the law enforcement community in negative situations instead of positive situations. So it didn't leave them with a positive experience. Now, I know that we have incredible amounts of positive experiences available for our youth with respect to the Atlantic City PAL and with a lot of the other relationships that we have throughout the entire community. So, you know, we have to get better at actively recruiting, actively getting people that are involved in showing them how they can serve their community. But I think it's happening, and all you have to do is look to the most recent class of recruits that were just hired. But it even goes a step further than that. We touched on it a little bit earlier with talking about the role of prosecutors and the role that we play in law enforcement. You go out throughout this country, and these are based on 2015 numbers from National District Attorneys Association. 96.5% of chief prosecutors throughout the entire country are white males. And that's nothing against them, but when you're looking at law enforcement through a particular lens, you're going to get the same thing. If you're a black female or a minority female that's a chief prosecutor in this country, you're almost like a unicorn. It's very rare. You'll see it in Baltimore. You see, you see it in Chicago, Kimberly Ross. See it in Milwaukee. Very few. You can count them. In the state of New Jersey, and you see Attorney General Graywall, you see myself, and I think sometimes we might take it for granted. But you know, I'm here as the first African-American, first minority prosecutor since they've had prosecutors in Atlantic County, 1867. And it's something that I don't take lightly, but when you go throughout the history of the entire state, and I've looked at the numbers, 8 African-Americans in the entire state. Attorney General Graywall is the Bergen County prosecutor, first Sikh Indian. You look at Grace Park, who is acting in Union. And currently, we have Camellia Valdez and Esther Suarez up in Hudson and in Passaic counties. But that we can just name them, and all of us collectively. I mean, that's the lens of law enforcement. So it takes, you know, someone asked me a question a long time, and I get it a lot. Why did you step down from being a judge to become the prosecutor? And it's a very simple answer, because I realize the amount of discretion and the ability to help people from this position. As a judge, I was able to help a lot of people, and I'm proud of the service that I had as a Superior Court judge. But those cases were one by one. The policies that we're able to implement through the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office, through the Attorney General's Office, has such an impact on all of your lives. Every day that I get up, I get the opportunity to affect our 250,000 residents in Atlantic County and the 20 million tourists per year, 25 million tourists per year to Atlantic City and parts thereabout. So We really, and New Jersey is also different. New Jersey, Connecticut, and Alaska are the only places that appoint prosecutors. Everywhere else, they're elected. So, you might say in New Jersey, well, you don't get that opportunity. Well, you have to hold your legislators accountable for the representatives that they select. But it is certainly by fate that I'm here, and I welcome the opportunity to change the face of law enforcement every day that I serve, and I know that Attorney General Braywell shares that same vision.
Thank you. Quickly, General, before we get back to you, let me just say, Prosecutor Tiny was right about the diversity of the last group of the Class 2s who moved up to regular police officers, but just for the record, for Atlantic City, the class before that also had great diversity. So the chief is bringing in a whole new generation of officers, and he is to be complimented. And for the record, Atlantic City is moving very aggressively on diversity. The city council is for that, and the NACP is for that. Let me just take this opportunity with so many people here. I couldn't let this pass. This is sort of related, General, to not sort of, it's related to public safety. The Atlantic City Fire Department now is engaged in an effort to recruit people that ends May 3rd. So if anyone is here who wants to be a fire person or knows someone who wants to be a fire person, please tell them to reach out to the Atlantic City Fire Department. Charlie Goodman, stand up, is also our political action chairman for the NACP. He is actively involved along with Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, please stand up. You can see them. If you yourself want to be a fire person, someone in your family wants to be a fire person, a neighbor that you know wants to be a fire person in Atlantic City, and our charge, when I say our, as the NACP and as a council member to the chief, was that we want to see diversity in the fire department, and we want that diversity to mirror the people in Atlantic City and also what Chief White is doing. We'll continue with questions.
What is being done about the vaping epidemic in youth? Every store sells them and makes it look appealing to kids.
It's an excellent question. The question was, what are we doing about the vaping epidemic? Kids with the smokeless cigarettes, the e-cigarettes, the Juuls. It is an issue we are looking at. I'm somewhat limited in what I could talk about with respect to our efforts when it comes to vaping. I would just say that a number of my fellow attorneys general in other states have brought actions, I think from a consumer protection standpoint, against some of the manufacturers. And so in New Jersey, we're exploring our options to hold folks accountable if there's any deceit in advertising, if there's any other types of fraudulent conduct. We're looking at that. I know the councilman plugged the fire department, but remember, state police, April 29th to May 12th,
Right.
njtrooper.com.
Give them that again.
njtrooper.com. So the application period starts today, closes on May 12th for the initial applications. And we talk about diversity and leadership. It starts with the classes that come in, and as they progress over their 20 to 25-year career, that's where the next lieutenant colonels come from. That's where the next colonel comes from. And I'm proud of the last two classes that we've had, the 158th and 159th, which is in the academy right now. They're 1/3 diverse. So we've made great progress, but we could make even more progress if we have the help of everyone in this room tonight.
General, what are the age requirements for state police?
I think it's 18. No, there's 2 years of school. 20? 21. 21. All that information is at njtrooper.com. And there's a combination of educational and work requirement that could meet some of the education requirements, and that's all listed on the website.
The merchants are being plagued day and night by pay criminals. The police take individuals in, but have to release them because of bail fees. Those same individuals are back the same day. What can you tell the law-abiding merchants who are providing goods and services to them?
everyone heard the question about bail reform and individuals being arrested for petty offenses, being re-released, or maybe issued summonses and then are back on the streets. You know, I can't speak to specific acts of recidivism or specific occurrences, whether it's in Atlantic City or in a particular area. I could tell you that on the whole, bail reform, criminal justice reform has been a success across this state. We voted on it as a constitutional amendment. We moved from a cash-based system to a risk-based system, where we had a system in place before where people who could afford it could get out on bails that were set by a schedule, depending on the type of crime. So if you committed a serious crime, you could pay a high amount of bail and get out. And those who committed petty offenses but could not afford the bail sometimes stayed in longer than their sentence would be, and then they would ultimately plead out to charges. It wasn't an equitable system. That you had low-risk defendants on low bails who couldn't afford it, who stayed in for a period of time beyond what they would be staying in for if they pled out. So we moved to a risk-based system where there's a risk assessment done for each defendant at the time of arrest, and based on that, the court determines whether that person should be in or out, or whether they should be on some form of monitoring if they're out. This is the first time we could actually argue to keep somebody in because of the risk that they pose to our community. Again, before, all those people could just pay a bail and get out. And over the course of the last 2 years, the pretrial jail population has gone down nearly in half, and the crime rate has not gone up. The crime rate, in fact, has continued to go down as well. So in my mind, the fact that they're not low-risk individuals who are in jail simply because they can't afford it, and the crime rate not going up, I think it's a success. And I think there are going to be outliers where individuals get a summons or are out, and it's an issue that we have to deal with. But we also have to deal with the root causes of what's causing people to engage in criminal activity. And we've got to also focus our efforts on the front end of the juvenile justice system to prevent young people from getting on this track of criminal behavior. So there are a lot of fixes here, and I think you know, scrapping bail reform and scrapping what we've accomplished is not the answer.
Is it state law or local practice that officers charged with multiple obsessive complaints who settle cases out of court that their behavior does not go into their employment file? Some officers have many charges, but settlements obscure their records.
So I believe the question is about officers and settlements.
Officers charged with multiple obsessive complaints who settle cases outside of court that doesn't go into the employment file.
I'm not sure that's true. I think, you know, there's two separate issues. If the case is in court, it's typically brought by an individual plaintiff against the officer for committing some sort of violation of their civil rights or for some other cause of action. And how that case is resolved is a matter for the civil courts to handle. And certainly departments keep track of those types of things. And then there's the internal affairs function, where an officer might be charged with multiple offenses during the course as a result of an internal affairs investigation. And it is not atypical for that officer to plead to some different offense in place rather than go through a hearing process. But all of that information remains in that officer's IA file and should be there, regardless of what they ended up pleading to. So it's not making all that disappear. It's whatever the disposition of that internal affairs investigation is, could be different than the initial charges. And that's sometimes because the investigation shows something different, or other times because they can come to a just resolution to a different charge. But the underlying conduct should remain in the IA file.
Who investigates police-involved shootings?
So the officer-involved shootings, if it's a fatal officer-involved shooting or in custody death, the Attorney General's office, our shooting response team, which the director here oversees. If it's a non-fatal officer-involved shooting, then we use the directive that we had in place, the independent prosecutor directive that I spoke about earlier. It's our county prosecutors, not our local departments. They hold the scene until the Atlantic County prosecutor can respond, and then conflicts checks are done. If there are no conflicts, then the county prosecutor continues with his or her investigation. Their conclusions are sent to us. We review them, and then a decision's made. Do you present it to the grand jury? Was the shooting legally justified? And based on undisputed facts, it doesn't have to be presented. That's a decision that's made that we review and authorize. And we could always tell them to act in a different way and present a case if they decide not to.
Someone from the crowd asked you to clarify what you mean by implicit bias.
Yeah, so implicit bias is really is the thought that all of us carry with us some sort of deep-seated biases. We might not realize we have them, but all of us have some type of implicit bias. And there are all sorts of tests available online. They're called IATs that you can go and take and determine what your implicit bias is. And the goal there is to identify your implicit bias. It might be, something small, like I don't, like individuals who are short, or I don't like fat people, or I don't like, people who are tall, right? I have something against somebody's race. Could be any sort of bias. And so these association tests help you identify that bias. And then the goal is to identify that bias and to keep it in check and not let it interfere with your decision-making as a law enforcement officer. And it's also, it's very subtle too. These trainings are meant to, identify for those officers that they might be behaving differently when they're dealing with the minority that they stop. That, in one case, if I'm going up to an African-American suspect, I'm going like this, and I'm blading myself. But when I go to the white guy I stopped, I'm going like this, right? So through your body language, you're conveying a bias that you have. And that's just one example from these trainings that we're trying to show officers how they may have these biases to keep them in check so they're treating everyone fairly and approaching everyone in the same manner.
All right, everyone, this is the last question. This is Attorney General. Atlantic City Police more often charges minority officers for a citizen complaint. However, they never found guilty of their friends and family members. Why? When will it change? No precision. Is it really bad in ACPD?
So the question was about the internal affairs process. And again, I'm not going to talk about specific departments or specific cases. I'll just simply say this. We monitor all of this. The county prosecutor monitors all of this in the first place. We monitor it as a backstop. And they're required to give reports to the county prosecutor. And the county prosecutors are required to give reports to us. And as we build out these new systems and these new portals, we intend to use those reports as more of an accountability measure to hold Damon accountable if he's not holding his folks accountable, if there's any deviations in the way the internal affairs process is running out, and where we need to step in. Like I gave that example earlier of Union County, we will step in if the IA function is not being run in a proper manner. So we are vigilant about it, and if you lose confidence in the IA function, forget about it. We can't rebuild that trust because that's supposed to be the check on local law enforcement. And that, if you look at our internal affairs guidelines that the Attorney General gives to all of our municipal police departments and county prosecutors, if you read that, it's a 45-page document with a number of attachments. It's all about how we can maintain the integrity of that process, how we can maintain public trust and the outcomes that that process is supposed to produce, and about how much care is given to that process to make sure it's run out properly. And so we're committed at the Attorney General's office to holding all of our county prosecutors accountable and our municipal departments accountable to run out those processes the right way. And if you feel like that's not being done in a local department where you live, you could report it to Prosecutor Tyner, or you could report it to us at the Attorney General's office. And we take these complaints seriously, so seriously that we stood up an entirely separate office of accountability. And so that should be a demonstration of our commitment to get this right. So I thank you all for your time. It's been instructive. Thank you.
We'll have to make final remarks. We'll have to make final remarks. Before before we go, no, sir. No, we're not going to. Before we go, we're going to have Reverend Steve, Steve, you can ask him afterwards. We're getting ready to close. No, you're going to ask him afterwards.
I have one question. I was really humble.
Steve,
we talk about good behavior.
Steve,
This is not a political event.
No, it's not political, and everybody went by the same rules. We're gonna ask you to go by the same rules. Reverend Coxon is gonna come up and make remarks. You can do it afterwards.
We've had many discussions in the past, but yeah.
We met in January 23rd this year. Same type of session, community session. At that time, we were asked for years when it comes to Atlantic City to communicate with the community. Some people on the front line, and I'm one of them. And so I take it very serious when it comes to the lives of Atlantic City. I don't play politics. So I only ask you, and as a citizen, as a resident, also there's a citizen advisory board in Atlantic City. And me and George Smiley have met with you in your office many a times. And still, we have not heard from you to do that. Just about accountability, and we would like, from this minute on, to have that type of communication. Because if we don't get it from the top to the bottom, then
Yeah.
with trust,
No, I got it.
trust is very important. We want to continue
Yeah.
to have that type of trust and that type of.
So here's my response to you, Mr. Young. Anytime you wanted a meeting with me in my office, we've had that meeting. Councilman Shabazz invited me here tonight. I'm here. You invite me back to a different venue to meet with the community, I'm happy to come back and answer more questions. I don't duck a question. I don't duck a meeting. It starts from the top that I've got to set the tone, and I've got to hear everyone's complaints and concerns, because that's the only way we're going to improve. We had a lengthy discussion in Bridgeton. We've had lengthy discussions in my office. If you would like for me to hear certain concerns in Atlantic City, I'm happy to come and hear those concerns. But what I cannot give you, and what I cannot give you in a setting like this, is the status of any investigations or confirm for you what we're looking at or not looking at, as you've asked me in the past. So if that's the question you want to ask, I cannot give you an answer to a question like that. I have never turned down a community meeting in this state. I am trying to get to all 21 of our counties, and I think I've hit them pretty much by now. I've stood up that 21-21 program to have 84 community meetings across the state. These conversations are important to me, and if you'd like me to come back in a different setting and have further conversation and talk to a different group of folks, I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to do that, Steve. I did it with the councilman. I'm happy to do it with you.
Right.
Yeah.
We did that.
Yeah.
Okay, just for the record, since people say they don't want to play politics, the Attorney General was here in Atlantic City last summer with more than 150 people, and we walked through a significant amount of Atlantic City. That happened. He was here, he stayed after, he took questions, he met with the media. That happened in, July? July, and several people in this room actually walked with him. That happened. So let's just be clear. We thank all of you for coming out, but before we disperse, we want to do three things. First of all, St. James AME is a church that is always open for social concerns and civil rights. And we wanted to thank the pastor, Reverend James Coxon, for allowing us to...
Just briefly, we want to really just say thank you to our Attorney General Aguirre for being here tonight. We also want to say thank you to Prosecutor Tyner. And we especially want to say thank you to the NAACP they've had several forums dealing with different issues. And if we're going to really bring the community together, this is where it starts. I call these social justice forums. There's so many injustices, in our cities, especially when we think about, brown and black people. And my particular focus is on young people. And so we want to say thank you for what you've done. And we hope that we will continue this dialogue and that we will continue working together with our public officials to make our streets safer and our communities better. Also, let me just say thank you to this Next Gen group as well for their leadership and what they're doing. And once again, we say thank you to the NAACP for also raising up another general another generation of young people who will also have a critical conscience as well. And once again, I thank all of you for being here. And the last thing I really want to say is that when we think about the AME Church, we have a social justice agenda, and so that's why we are always appreciative, and our doors are always open for these forums. So once again, thank you, and may God continue to bless and keep all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Reverend Coxon. Two more things before we close. Just for